Hi, everyone! Before we jump into this, I need to ask for a quick favor. If you enjoy these stories and want to hear more, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We've noticed that not many people watch until the end, and it really helps keep things going. All right, now let's get into it. I grew up in what most people would call a perfect life. My name's Jake. I'm 28, and I was raised in a wealthy family in the Boston suburbs. My dad, Richard, was a top-tier lawyer, the kind that made headlines with big cases, and my mom, Margaret, was all about maintaining our family's pristine image. She ran charity events, attended high society lunches, and made sure our name always carried a certain level of prestige. Growing up, I was exactly what my parents expected me to be: straight A's, captain of my university baseball team, a 3.9 GPA, and a solid career path in finance ahead of me. I did everything right, never strayed from the path they set for me. Then there was Lily. When I was 11, my parents adopted a 4-year-old girl, Lily. She came from some rough background, though my parents never talked about it much. They framed it as their way of giving back, a feel-good story for their social circle. And it worked! Everyone praised them for their generosity, for taking in a child in need. But from the very beginning, Lily was different. At first, I didn't mind having a little sister, but things changed fast. She became the center of attention. If I aced a test, nice, but did you see Lily's drawing? If I won a baseball game, that's great, but Lily just had her first recital. It was like my achievements paled in comparison to the fact that they had saved this little girl. And yeah, I'll admit it, I was jealous. I was a kid who suddenly had to compete for attention, and no matter what I did, I was never the priority. It wasn't outright neglect, they still supported me, still praised me when it was socially appropriate, but when it came down to it, Lily was always the one they doted on. By the time we were teenagers, things had settled into an uneasy rhythm. We got along on the surface, but there was always this underlying tension. She had a habit of twisting things to make herself look like the victim. If we argued, she'd start crying and I'd be the one getting scolded. If something went missing, even if I had nothing to do with it, I was the first suspect. It was exhausting, and after a while, I just stopped trying. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what was coming. It was a Tuesday evening in October, my last year of university, and I was exhausted. Practice had been brutal, the kind of session where the coach made us run drills until our legs felt like jelly. My shoulder ached from too many bullpen sessions, but it was a good kind of soreness, the kind that reminded me I was pushing myself to my limits. I hit the showers, changed into jeans and a hoodie, and grabbed my phone on the way out to my truck, expecting nothing more than a couple of texts from friends. Instead, my screen was flooded with notifications. 37 missed calls, dozens of messages. "You sick bastard. You're a scumbag. They'll find you." My stomach dropped. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, an accident, maybe, or a death in the family. I called my dad immediately, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the ringing. He picked up after the first ring, but his voice was cold, more emotionless than I had ever heard it. "Come home immediately. Don't you dare go anywhere." Then he hung up. I stood there in the empty parking lot, my hands going numb despite the warmth of my hoodie. Something was wrong, really, really wrong. I drove home in silence, the usual music on my radio replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I kept trying to piece together what could have happened, but nothing made sense. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw more cars than usual. My Uncle George's truck was there, along with my grandparents' sedan and a few others I didn't recognize. The front door was slightly open, the glow from the living room casting long shadows onto the porch. I barely had time to step inside before the tension in the room hit me like a physical force. Everyone was there. My dad stood in the center, his face unreadable but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. My mother sat on the couch, her face blotchy from crying. My grandmother held Lily in her arms, rocking her gently as she sobbed into her shoulder. My Uncle George, a construction worker built like a bulldozer with a temper to match, was already moving toward me. The next thing I knew, he had grabbed my shirt and slammed me against the wall so hard that picture frames rattled. His face was inches from mine, his breath heavy with beer and rage. "I'll kill you, you bastard," he spat, shaking me hard enough that my head snapped back. "What the hell is going on?" I choked out, trying to push him off, but he was stronger than I expected, and I was too blindsided to fight back. My dad's voice cut through the room like ice. "She told us everything." I turned toward him, still gasping for breath, but George didn't let go. My father's expression was stone cold. His eyes locked on mine as if I were a stranger. "How you came into her room for years. How you threatened her to keep quiet." For a second, I couldn't comprehend what I was hearing. The words didn't make sense. They sounded like some kind of bad dream, one that I'd wake up from any second now. Then Lily let out a broken sob, burying her face deeper into my grandmother's arms. And it hit me. They were talking about her, about Lily, about me. A slow, creeping horror spread through my chest, a sickening realization that made my stomach twist. "What?" My voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. "That's crazy. It's not true." "I never." "Shut your mouth," my dad barked. I looked at my mother, desperate, searching for some sign that she didn't believe this, that she could see how insane it was, but she wouldn't even look at me. She just shook her head, her fingers twisting a crumpled tissue in her lap. "No," I said, my voice rising. "No, this is insane. You can't actually believe this." But they did. My uncle shoved me again, his grip still tight on my shirt. But this time I fought back, ripping myself free and stumbling backward. My pulse was racing so fast I thought I might throw up. My dad stepped forward now, his face twisted with disgust. "Get out." I shook my head, trying to force my brain to work through the panic. "Dad, listen to me. I didn't. He didn't let me finish." In a single sharp movement, he reached out and shoved me. I wasn't expecting it, wasn't braced for it, and the force sent me stumbling back through the open front door. My foot missed the first step, and before I knew it, I was tumbling backward, crashing down the porch stairs. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring through my ribs and knocking the air from my lungs. I lay there for a second, dazed, looking up at the night sky as my father's shadow loomed over me. "You're not my son," he said, voice thick with hatred. "You come near this house again, and I swear to God I'll have you arrested." I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my body aching from the fall. My head was spinning. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. "Dad," I tried again, but he wasn't listening. He reached inside the doorway and grabbed something, my wallet. He pulled out every card with his name on it, credit cards, my university tuition card, my health insurance. Then he threw the empty wallet at me. It hit my chest and landed in the dirt. "I'm canceling everything," he said. "You're cut off." "If I see you again, I'll sue you myself." And then the door slammed shut. I sat there, stunned, the cold air burning in my lungs. A few seconds later, the porch light flicked off, leaving me in the dark. My whole life, everything I had ever known, was gone. The weeks that followed were a blur of chaos, anger, and desperation. I kept waiting for some kind of explanation, for someone to realize how absurd this all was, but the calls never came. Instead, everything I had built over the years crumbled around me, piece by piece. The first blow came just days after I was thrown out. My tuition had been paid in advance by my parents, but since my father was the one funding it, he wasted no time in pulling every last cent. I found out when I logged into the university portal and saw the notice. My account was overdue, and if I didn't pay by the end of the month, I'd be dropped from my classes. I tried going to the financial aid office, pleading for emergency assistance, but without a cosigner or any credit history, I was out of options. At the same time, rumors spread like wildfire. It started as whispers in the hallways, then turned into outright avoidance. People the first had known for years, teammates, classmates, even casual acquaintances suddenly refused to meet my eyes. Some went further, crossing the street when they saw me coming, leaving the room when I walked in. I had never felt invisible before, but this was worse. It was like I existed only as a shadow, something people knew of but refused to acknowledge. It didn't take long before I was cut from the baseball team. At first, the coach tried to stand by me. He told me to focus, to keep my head down, that people would come around. But when the accusations started creeping into team meetings, when my teammates refused to warm up with me, when even rival schools started making jokes about it during games, it became too much. One afternoon, I was called into his office, and without even looking at me, he handed me the papers. "Jake, I fought for you," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "but this is bigger than baseball. The administration doesn't want the attention, and the team, they're not with you. I don't have a choice." I don't remember leaving his office. I just remember sitting in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, trying to keep myself from smashing my fist into the dashboard. With no tuition and no scholarship, I had to find work fast. I picked up 2 jobs, one as a security guard at a bar downtown, and another doing overnight stock shifts at a grocery store. The shifts blurred together, day and night bleeding into each other as I ran on nothing but caffeine and the sheer refusal to break. I didn't have time to grieve what I had lost. I was too busy trying to survive. But survival wasn't enough. Rent was due, and even with both jobs, I couldn't keep up. My landlord was sympathetic. At first, he had known me for over a year and had always seen me as a responsible tenant, but sympathy didn't pay the bills, and by the end of the second month, the eviction notice was taped to my door. I had no one to turn to. My parents had made it clear I was dead to them, and every friend I had once trusted was gone. Even those who didn't outright believe Lily's lies still kept their distance, afraid to be associated with me. It wasn't worth the risk to them. Selling my car could have given me enough money for another month or 2 of rent, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My truck was the last thing I had, the only piece of my old life that still belonged to me. It was my transportation, my storage, and soon enough, it became my home. For a while, I managed to stay at the university gym. I would sneak in late at night, using my old student ID before it was deactivated, and sleep on the mats in the back room. The showers kept me looking somewhat presentable, and I convinced myself that this was temporary, that I would find a way out of this. But when campus security finally caught on, that small bit of stability was ripped away too. With nowhere else to go, I moved into my truck. I parked in the far end of grocery store lots, avoiding well-lit areas where I'd be noticed. I learned which places wouldn't call the cops if I stayed too long, and which gas stations had bathrooms I could wash up in without too many questions. I slept with my jacket as a blanket and my duffel bag as a pillow, listening to the sounds of the city outside my windows. Nights were the hardest. That was when my mind would wander, when the weight of everything I had lost crashed down on me. I used to have a future, one I had worked for, one I had earned, and now, because of a lie, I was nothing, just another nobody trying to make it through another night. The worst part was knowing that Lily was still in that house, still in that warm, perfect life, while I was out here freezing in a parking lot, and no one cared. The months turned into a blur, and I lost track of time. My days were spent working whatever jobs I could find, my nights sleeping in my truck, parked in different places to avoid attention. The exhaustion was constant, settling deep into my bones, but it wasn't just my body that felt drained. It was everything, my mind, my will, the part of me that used to care. I stopped thinking about the future because there wasn't one. The only thing that mattered was getting through the next shift, the next night, the next minute. At some point, I stopped fighting the idea that this was my life now. My old self, the one with the baseball career, the finance dreams, the perfect GPA, he was gone. What was left was a version of me that just existed, drifting from one dead-end job to another. When I saw a flyer for a job at a wilderness program in Colorado, something inside me told me to go. It was a camp for troubled teens, kids whose parents sent them there to fix them drugs, crime, bad attitudes, whatever the case was. The pay wasn't great, but it offered free housing, which meant I wouldn't have to sleep in my truck anymore. That alone was reason enough for me to take it. I packed what little I had and drove straight there, barely thinking about what I was doing. I just needed something different. At first, it seemed like a decent enough place. I spent my days leading hikes, teaching survival skills, setting up camps in the mountains. The physical work was brutal, but it was the kind of exhaustion that let me forget, even for a little while. I didn't have to think when I was chopping wood or carrying heavy packs through the wilderness. I could just be. But nights were harder. That was when the memories crept in, the whispers of everything I had lost. I tried ignoring them, but silence made it worse. I started drinking just a little at first, just enough to take the edge off, but it wasn't long before a few drinks turned into more, and more turned into blackout nights. It was easier that way. Being numb was better than feeling. Drinking wasn't enough, though. Some of the other staff had their own ways of coping: weed, pills, things that made the nights quieter. It didn't take much for me to fall into it, too. The drugs dulled everything, blurred the edges of my thoughts, and made it easier to pretend that nothing mattered. And then, one night, something happened that shattered the illusion completely. It was supposed to be a routine hike, a multi-day trek through the mountains with a group of boys. We had done it a dozen times before, and I knew the trails by heart. But that night, I had been hung over from the night before, my head still pounding as I tried to push through. One of the boys, a 15-year-old named Ryan, had been lagging behind. He wasn't used to the altitude, and he had complained about dizziness earlier that day. I should have paid more attention. I should have made him rest. But I didn't. Somewhere along the trail, he lost his footing. 1 second he was there, walking a few feet behind me. The next, he was gone. I heard the scream first, then the sound of rocks shifting, and when I turned, he was already tumbling down the slope. By the time we reached him, it was too late. The next few days were a haze of police reports, emergency meetings, and quiet conversations that I wasn't allowed to be part of. The camp director called me into his office the day after the funeral, his face unreadable as he folded his hands on the desk. "You're done here, Jake," he said, his voice flat. "I can't have someone like you in charge of kids, when you can't even keep yourself together." There was no point in arguing. He was right. I packed up my things, which wasn't much, and drove south. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to keep moving. Eventually, I ended up in New Mexico, where I found work on construction sites during the day and in clubs as a security guard at night. The jobs were mindless, just the way I needed them to be. I spent my nights standing at the entrance of crowded nightclubs, breaking up fights, watching drunk people stumble in and out of the neon lights. It paid enough to keep gas in my truck and food in my stomach. That was all I cared about, but it wasn't enough to escape the past. It followed me, lingering in the corners of every room, waiting for the right moment to remind me who I had become. And then one night, it caught up with me in the worst way. It was late, past 2 in the morning, and I had just finished my shift at one of the clubs downtown. The streets were mostly empty, the only sounds coming from the occasional passing car with a distant hum of music from nearby bars. I was heading to my truck, ready to collapse into the driver's seat, when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Drunk people wandered around all the time, but when I turned the corner, they followed. Then I heard one of them laugh. "Hey, look who it is," a voice sneered. "Didn't think we'd ever see your face again." I turned slowly, my muscles already tensing. 3 guys stood there, their faces half lit by the flickering streetlights. It took me a second to place them, but when I did, my stomach clenched. They were from my old university. I didn't know their names, but I recognized them from the campus gym, from the parties I used to go to, from the stands at my baseball games. They knew exactly who I was, and worse, They knew the rumors. You still out here pretending to be normal? Another one of them spat. Like we don't all know what you are. I took a step back, keeping my hands loose at my sides. I don't want any trouble, I said, my voice calm despite the way my pulse was hammering in my ears. Oh, you don't want trouble? The third one mocked, taking a step forward. You think you get to just walk around like nothing happened? I knew where this was going before. They even threw the first punch. I managed to land one hit before the three of them were on me. One grabbed my jacket, another slammed a fist into my ribs, and the third caught me across the face so hard. My vision went white. I stumbled back, gasping as pain exploded through my side. A kick sent me to the ground, my head smacking against the pavement. Someone laughed. Piece of garbage, one of them muttered before spitting next to me. Then they were gone. I don't know how long I lay there. Time didn't make sense. All I knew was pain, sharp, unbearable pain that made every breath feel like fire. At some point, a car pulled up, headlights washing over me. A woman's voice called out, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. Everything felt slow and heavy, my limbs refusing to move. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed. The bright lights burned my eyes, and the dull beeping of machines filled the air. I tried to sit up, but my entire body screamed in protest. A nurse appeared, her face lined with concern. You're lucky, she said. Broken rib, concussion, some deep bruising. Could have been worse. I barely heard her. My mind was still spinning, still trying to process everything. Then she handed me a clipboard. Before you leave, you need to figure out how you're paying for this. I glanced down at the paper in my hands. The hospital bill was enough to ruin me completely. The hospital discharged me with nothing but a bottle of painkillers and a bill that I had no way of paying. I didn't even bother arguing what was the point. I walked out of there with bruises still blooming across my ribs, my head pounding from the concussion, and a sickening emptiness in my chest. I had nothing left, no money, no home, no future. There was no coming back from this. I drove without thinking, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rain started somewhere along the highway light at first, then growing heavier until the wipers could barely keep up. I didn't care. I barely even saw the road. All I knew is that I needed to get away, as far as possible from the hospital, from the city, from everything. At some point, I ended up at an old bridge just outside of town, one that stretched high over a river swollen from the storm. I wasn't even sure how I had gotten there, but it didn't matter. The moment I saw it, I knew this was it, this was where it all ended. I pulled over and got out, the cold rain soaking through my clothes almost instantly. The wind howled through the steel beams above me, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. I climbed up onto the ledge, gripping the rusted railing as I stared down at the dark water below. It didn't feel dramatic, it didn't feel like anything really. There was no fear, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty that this was the only thing left for me. No more running, no more fighting, no more waking up to nothing, just silence. Then I heard a voice. It's a little late for a swim, isn't it? I flinched, my grip tightening on the railing as I turned my head. A man stood a few feet away, wearing an old rain jacket and holding a fishing pole. His hair was gray, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, studying me with the kind of calm that made my pulse stutter. Go away, I muttered, turning back to the river. Can't do that, he said, stepping closer, his boots splashing in the puddles. See, if I leave and you jump, then it's my problem too, and I don't like problems. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling from more than just the cold. I don't need a lecture, old man. I'm not giving you one, he said simply. Just figured I'd say something before you made a choice you can't take back. I didn't answer, I just stared down at the water, watching the way the rain shattered the surface into ripples. For a long time, we just stood there. Then, before I even realized what I was doing, the words started spilling out. I told him everything. I told him about my family, about Lily, about the lies that destroyed my life. I told him about the nights I spent sleeping in my truck, about the jobs that barely kept me afloat. I told him about the fight, the hospital, the bill that had finally pushed me over the edge. He didn't interrupt. He didn't say anything at all. He just stood there, listening, nodding every now and then, as if he had all the time in the world. By the time I finished, I felt hollow. The wind howled between us, carrying the scent of wet earth and rusted metal. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but I barely noticed. Finally, Tom, because that was his name, I would learn later, let out a slow breath. "I have a job," he said. "Going to be hard, but if you still want to fight, come back tomorrow at 8. I turned to look at him, confused. "What? You heard me." He adjusted his grip on his fishing pole. "You got 2 choices, kid. You can jump, or you can show up tomorrow and see if there's still something worth sticking around for." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned and started walking away, disappearing into the rain. For a long time, I stood there, still gripping the railing, still staring at the water. Then, slowly, I climbed back down. The next morning, I showed up at 8. I wasn't sure why, maybe because I didn't have anywhere else to go, maybe because I wasn't ready to jump just yet, or maybe, for the first time in years, someone had given me a choice that wasn't just survival or suffering. Tom's firm wasn't some high-rise corporate office. It was a security company, private contracts, event, protection, bodyguard work, the kind of place that took in guys like me, people with nowhere else to go but who were willing to work. Tom didn't say much when I walked in, just handed me a uniform and told me to follow him. At first, it was just a job, another way to keep myself from starving. The hours were long, the pay wasn't great, and some of the work was mind-numbing, standing at doors, checking IDs, breaking up fights when drunk idiots got too rowdy. But it was steady. I had a place to sleep, food to eat, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up wondering if I would make it through the day. Months passed, then a year. Somewhere along the way, I started wanting more. I saw how the older guys carried themselves, the way they knew what to do in any situation. Some of them had backgrounds in law enforcement, others in the military. I had none of that, but I had discipline, and I learned fast. I got my security certifications, then took additional training in risk assessment and crisis management. Tom saw the effort and pushed me further. "You've got a brain," he said one day, watching as I handled an incident report. "Might as well use it." So I did. I started taking online business courses after shifts, studying in the break room or my tiny apartment above the firm's office. I learned about contracts, negotiations, liability management, everything that made the company run beyond just standing at doors and looking intimidating. The work paid off. 2 years in, I wasn't just another security guard. I was managing contracts, overseeing teams, making decisions that actually mattered. And then, one day, Tom called me into his office and tossed a folder onto the desk. "Partnership papers," he said gruffly. "You've earned it." I stared at him, stunned. "You serious?" Wouldn't waste my breath if I wasn't. I took the deal. Somewhere in all of this, I met Sophie. She was Tom's niece, though you wouldn't guess it at first. Where he was rough around the edges, she was sharp and effortless. She had this quiet confidence, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but got it anyway. She was independent, smart, and an artist completely different from anyone I had ever met. And at first, we didn't get along at all. She thought I was just another one of her uncle's charity cases, some lost cause he had taken in. I thought she was spoiled, someone who had never seen how ugly the world could be. We argued every time we were in the same room, neither of us willing to back down. But somehow, through all the bickering, we became friends. She challenged me in ways I wasn't used to. She didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile. didn't tiptoe around my past like it was some dark secret. She just called me out on my nonsense, pushed me when I tried to retreat into old habits, and made me laugh in ways I hadn't in years. I started seeing her differently, and one day, without meaning to, I realized I didn't just want her friendship. It took time, but eventually, she felt the same. 3 years after I first walked into Tom's office, I knelt down in front of Sophie and asked her to marry me. She said yes. On our wedding day, Tom walked her down the aisle her father had passed years ago, and there was no one else she trusted more to do it. I stood at the altar, watching them, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Happiness. Real, undeniable happiness. And this time, I wasn't waiting for it to be taken away. It was an ordinary afternoon at the office when my phone rang. I barely glanced at the screen, expecting another work call or a routine update from one of our security teams. But the second I saw the name, I froze. My mother. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my heartbeat slowing into something deep and heavy. It had been years since I had heard her voice, years since she had last spoken my name. Part of me wanted to let it ring, to let it go to voicemail, to pretend I never saw it, but my hands moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I pressed the answer button and lifted the phone to my ear. I didn't say anything. There was a pause, a shaky breath, then a voice I had once known better than my own. Jake? That's it, Mom. Everything inside me went cold. For years, I had imagined this moment, thought about what I would say if she ever called, if she ever reached out. I had promised myself that I would be ready, that I would have something sharp and final to say. But now that she was here, now that I could hear the tremble in her voice, I had nothing. She let out another shaky breath, and then, in a voice so fragile it barely sounded like her, she spoke the words that shattered everything I had spent years trying to rebuild. Lily confessed. The world around me went silent. She lied, my mother continued, her voice breaking. She just wanted more attention. I gripped the desk, my knuckles turning white. She kept talking, but I wasn't listening anymore. My head was pounding, my vision narrowing, the office around me blurring into something distant and unreal. Lily lied. She had lied, and they had believed her. I closed my eyes, breathing through the wave of nausea that crashed over me. Everything the years I had lost, the nights spent starving in my truck, the people who had beaten me in a parking lot, the hospital bill that had nearly broken me, the shame, the anger, the nights I had come so close to giving up all of it because of a lie. I didn't realize I was shaking until Sophie walked into the room, her eyes going straight to my face. She must have seen something in my expression because she crossed the space between us instantly, reaching for my hand. I barely registered it. I could still hear my mother's voice on the other end of the line, rambling, crying, whispering apologies. I didn't ask for, but I didn't say a word. I just hung up, and for the first time in years, I had no idea what to do next. A week later, I met them at a small cafe on the other side of town. I wasn't sure why I agreed. Maybe I just needed to see it for myself, to look them in the eye one last time and hear whatever excuses they had prepared. When I walked in, they were already there, sitting at a booth in the back. My father looked older, his shoulders not as straight as I remembered, his once perfect posture weighed down by something heavier than time. His suit, the kind he used to wear with effortless confidence, now seemed too loose on him. My mother, always polished, always put together, looked like a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her hair, once perfectly styled, was streaked with gray, and there were lines on her face that hadn't been there before. Then there was Lily. She was 22 now, an adult, though she looked nothing like the girl I had last seen sobbing in my grandmother's arms. The expensive clothes, the delicate jewelry, all of it was gone. She wore a simple uniform, the kind that belonged to someone who spent her days serving tables and scraping together tips. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my father cleared his throat and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "We want you to come back," he said, his voice hoarse. My mother nodded quickly, her hands twisting in her lap. "We're a family, Jake." I let out a quiet breath and smiled, not out of happiness, not out of relief, but out of something colder. "Family?" the first repeated, shaking my head. "You threw me away like garbage. You believed a lie without a shred of evidence. You let me starve, let me sleep in my truck, let me lose everything. And now, because your lives fell apart, you want me back?" My father looked away, shame flickering across his face. "You want help?" I continued, leaning forward slightly. "Where were you when I needed it?" No one answered. I stood up, pulled out my wallet, and placed enough money on the table to cover the coffee I hadn't touched. "I found a family," I said quietly, "but it's not you." Without another word, I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I never would. 2 years passed and I barely thought about them anymore. Life had moved forward, and so had I. Every now and then, I would hear whispers from people who still kept tabs on the family I had once belonged to. My father had lost everything. His business collapsed after a series of bad investments, his reputation shattered beyond repair. My mother, stripped of the social status she had once clung to so desperately, had faded into obscurity, no longer the perfect wife of a successful man. As for Lily, she had left. No one seemed to know exactly where she had gone, just that she had packed up and moved to another city, far from the wreckage she had created. But none of it mattered to me. I had built something real. My business was expanding, growing beyond what I had ever imagined. Tom had officially retired, but he still came by the office, still gave advice when I asked for it. He had become more than a mentor. He was my family, the father I should have had all along. And Sophie was everything. She had been my best friend, my partner, and now she was the mother of the child we were expecting. I sat on our porch one evening, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, and listened as Sophie talked about baby names, her voice full of excitement. I looked at her, at the life growing inside of her, and realized something that still felt new. Even after all this time, I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. Not because I had proven anything to anyone, not because I had rebuilt what was taken from me, but because I was free from the past, free from the weight of their betrayal, free to live the life I had created for myself. And for the first time, I knew this was the only family I would ever need. 2 years had passed since the last time I saw them in that cafe, and I had long since stopped thinking about them. My life was full in a way I had never thought possible. Work was thriving, the company was expanding into new contracts, and Sophie and I were preparing for the birth of our first child. My days were spent managing the business, my nights filled with quiet conversations with my wife about baby names, nursery colors, and all the small things that made our future feel real. Then one morning, Sophie walked into my office holding a registered letter, her face tight with something unreadable. She set the envelope down in front of me without a word. I glanced at the return address, a law firm. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, crossing her arms. I shook my head, already opening it. The moment my eyes landed on the first line, my entire body went cold. A lawsuit! A lawsuit for compensation for moral and financial damages. I read the words once, then again, and a third time, but no matter how many times I went over them, they didn't change. My parents had sued me. Not just any lawsuit. Either they were claiming that my bad reputation had led to the downfall of my father's business, that my existence had caused their financial ruin, that I was responsible for the debts they had accumulated over the years. They accused me of causing economic damage, sabotaging the family business, and even ruining their personal and professional reputations. I let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. This has to be a joke. But the thick stack of legal documents in my hand said otherwise. Sophie watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction. I flipped through the pages, my pulse thudding in my ears. They had detailed how, after cutting me off, my name had become associated with scandal, how my reputation, no, the false accusations that they had spread, that they had believed had supposedly driven away clients, investors, and business partners. They blamed me for their losses, for their house foreclosure, for every financial struggle they had faced since the day they threw me out, as if I had been the one who destroyed their lives. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around the papers. First, they had ruined me, they had let me rot in the streets, abandoned me, ignored me while I starved, while I fought to survive, and now, after all these years, after all their mistakes, they wanted me to pay for their failures. Sophie's voice was calm, but I could see the fire in her eyes. They actually think they can get money out of you? She said, shaking her head in disbelief. After everything they did? I exhaled slowly, forcing down the anger rising in my chest. They don't just think it, I said quietly, setting the papers down. They're desperate. That was all this was, desperation. They had lost everything, burned every bridge, and now they were grasping for anything, for anyone to blame. And they thought I would be an easy target. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. When Tom saw the lawsuit, he didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and made a call, his expression dark with something I hadn't seen before, pure, unwavering fury. Within hours, we were sitting in a high-rise office downtown, across from one of the most well-known civil litigation attorneys in the state. Andrew Holmes was a man with a reputation that made even corporate giants nervous. He had never lost a major case, and from the moment he walked into the room, I understood why. He was calm, precise, and efficient, flipping through the lawsuit with an unreadable expression. When he finished reading, he set the papers down, leaned back in his chair, and folded his hands in front of him. "They're counting on you not wanting to get dirty in court," he said simply, his voice cool and measured. "They think it'll be easier for you to pay them off and move on? We're not going to give them that." I nodded once. "What's the plan?" His strategy was straightforward but ruthless. First, we would prove beyond any doubt that my parents' financial problems had nothing to do with me. Their debts, their bankruptcy, their losses, everything had started long before they threw me out. Holmes's team would dig into their financial records, tax filings, and business statements to show that they had been in decline for years. Second, we would use Lily's history of false accusations as a motive for their continued actions against me. Her confession was the key. It wasn't just about what she had done to me years ago. It was about the pattern. She had lied for attention before, and now, even after her confession, my parents had chosen to double down instead of taking responsibility. That showed intent. That showed malice. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "We aren't just going to defend you. We're going to destroy their case before it even reaches trial. By the time we're done, they won't just lose, they'll regret ever filing this lawsuit." Sophie, who had been quiet until now, spoke up, her voice firm. "You have no right to give them a penny, Jake. Not 1 cent. I reached for her hand under the table and squeezed it gently. "I wasn't planning on it." She shook her head, her frustration clear. "It's absurd. First, they ruined your life. And now they want you to pay for their failures? They don't deserve anything," Tom grunted in agreement. "They're parasites, and it's time they learned the hard way that Jake isn't the same kid they threw out all those years ago." I exhaled slowly, the weight of it all settling over me. I had spent years trying to outrun the past, to build something separate from them, something that had nothing to do with their lies and betrayals. And now, just when I thought I had finally escaped, they had come back, trying to pull me down with them. But this time, I wasn't alone. This time, I had people who stood beside me. And this time, I was ready to fight. The court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. I arrived dressed in a dark suit, my lawyer Andrew Holmes at my side, along with Sophie and Tom. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid. I was just tired of them, tired of their desperation, tired of the fact that, Even after all these years, they still found ways to try and drag me back into their mess. On the other side of the courtroom, my parents sat stiffly with their lawyer, a man who looked more like a used car salesman than a serious attorney. His cheap suit, greasy hair, and overconfident smirk told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't hired someone good, they had hired someone cheap, someone who probably promised them that a sob story would be enough to win. I didn't have to wait long to see their strategy. The moment the judge allowed opening arguments, my father stood up, his voice thick with forced emotion. "Jake has ruined our reputation," he declared, gesturing wildly as if putting on a show. "Because of his behavior, because of his past, our business went bankrupt. We lost everything. We lost our home. We invested our whole lives in him, and when we needed help the most, he abandoned us like we meant nothing to him." My mother clutched a tissue, dabbing at non-existent tears, shaking her head dramatically as she spoke. "He could have helped us," she sniffled, her voice trembling, "but he just turned his back on us. After everything we gave him, after all the sacrifices we made, he repaid us with nothing but cruelty." They were playing the victims, hoping to stir the court's emotions, hoping that, despite the facts, someone would see them as grieving, struggling parents who had been betrayed by their only son. I remained silent, my hands folded neatly on the table in front of me. I could feel Sophie tense beside me, her fingers curling into her lap as she resisted the urge to say something. Tom, on the other hand, let out a quiet scoff, just enough for me to hear. Holmes didn't react at all. He just sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, letting them have their moment. I had seen this before, the same manipulation, the same lies, only this time I wasn't a kid standing on my parents' porch, begging them to believe me. This time I had power, and this time the truth was on my side. Holmes had been waiting for this moment. He let my parents play their performance, let them cry, let them paint themselves as the victims of my so-called betrayal. Then, without even a trace of hesitation, he stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked to the center of the courtroom with a stack of documents in his hand. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, his voice calm and unwavering, "the plaintiffs claim that my client caused their financial ruin, that his so-called bad reputation destroyed their business and left them bankrupt. However, the evidence tells a very different story." He moved to the first set of documents, placing them carefully in front of the judge. "These are bank statements from 2 years before my client was falsely accused and thrown out of his home. They show that Mr. Richard Carter had already taken out multiple high-risk loans for business ventures that ultimately failed." The judge skimmed through the paperwork, nodding slightly. Holmes continued, unfazed. "This," he said, holding up another file, "is the deed of sale for their house. You'll see that it was sold not because of my client, but because they were drowning in debt. The timeline makes it clear by the time they cut my client out of their lives, they were already in serious financial distress." He barely paused before moving to the next set of documents. "And finally, this is an independent financial audit of their firm, conducted at the request of former clients who left long before my client's name was ever associated with any scandal. The report clearly states that their losses were due to mismanagement, not because of my client." He placed the last file down and turned to face the judge directly. "My client had no involvement in his parents' business, no financial stake, no control over their management decisions. The idea that his reputation destroyed their company is not just unfounded, it's impossible." The court was silent. Then the judge, who had remained neutral throughout the proceedings, turned his gaze toward my father, his voice cold and sharp. "So, Mr. Carter," he said, tapping his fingers against the audit papers, "are you saying that your son is to blame for your failure to run your business properly?" My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at my mother as if searching for help, but she was frozen in her seat, her face pale with panic. For the first time, they had no answer. And for the first time, the truth was louder than their lies. The second day of the trial, was when everything truly fell apart for my parents. Holmes had anticipated their every move, and now it was time to dismantle whatever weak foundation they had left. The first witness took the stand, a former business partner of my father. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, composed but direct. Under oath, he confirmed what the financial records had already shown. My father had been in deep financial trouble long before I was thrown out. "I worked with Richard Carter for years," the man said, glancing at my father as he spoke. "And I can tell you with absolute certainty that his business problems had nothing to do with his son. He had taken on bad debts, risky investments, and by the time his personal life fell apart, his business was already on its last legs. If anything, he used that scandal as an excuse for his failures, instead of admitting to his own mismanagement." My father shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the table as the weight of those words settled over the courtroom. The second witness was a longtime family friend, a woman who had once been close to my mother, the kind who had attended every fundraiser, every charity event, every high society gathering my parents had been part of. But today, she sat on the witness stand with an expression of quiet disappointment. "I watched this family destroy itself," she said firmly, "and it was not because of Jake." When Lily finally told the truth, it wasn't him that the community turned against, it was them. People couldn't believe that two parents would throw their own son away so easily, refused to even consider that they might have been wrong. Their business didn't collapse because of Jake. It collapsed because no one trusted them anymore. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom as her words sank in. My mother's face was ghostly pale, her fingers twisting at the hem of her sleeve, while my father sat completely still, staring at the table in front of him. And then, finally, Lily was called to the stand. I hadn't seen her since our last meeting in the cafe years ago, and if I was being honest, I had never expected to see her again. She looked different now, older, but not in a way that spoke of wisdom or maturity. She looked tired, defeated, like someone who had spent years trying to outrun the damage she had done. She sat down, eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. But there was none, not this time. Holmes approached the witness stand, his voice even. "Lily Carter, can you confirm under oath that the accusation you made against your brother was false?" She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the stand before finally nodding. "Yes," she whispered. "It was false." A silence fell over the courtroom. Holmes let it stretch, just long enough, before asking his next question. "And why did you do it?" Lily hesitated, her hands tightening into fists. I just wanted more attention. I didn't know it would go this far." Holmes exhaled sharply and shook his head, unable to hide his frustration. "You didn't know?" he repeated, his voice edged with sarcasm. "Are you serious? You accused your own brother of something horrific. You watched as his life was destroyed, as he lost everything, and you want to sit here and say you didn't know?" Lily flinched, but Holmes wasn't finished. "Your brother was left homeless because of this," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "He was beaten in the street. He was forced to sleep in his car. He nearly died. And you didn't know?" Lily's face crumpled, but Holmes had already turned away from her, addressing the courtroom instead. "This case is not about financial compensation," he stated firmly. "It's about a family that refuses to take responsibility for their own actions, a father who failed his business, a mother who refused to see the truth, and a daughter who, whether out of selfishness or cruelty, destroyed a man's life. And now they expect him to pay for their failures." The judge, who had been listening quietly, finally leaned forward, his gaze settling on my parents. "Do you really think this man should pay you for your mistakes?" My parents didn't answer. They couldn't. Their faces had gone completely pale because they knew, just as everyone in that courtroom knew, that they had already lost. The final hearing was tense, but the outcome was never in doubt. My parents sat stiffly at their table, their lawyer looking more deflated with each passing moment. Holmes, as composed as ever, remained seated, hands folded, waiting for the inevitable. The courtroom was silent as the judge adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the papers in front of him before finally delivering his verdict. The court finds the plaintiff's claims to be without merit. The lawsuit is dismissed. My father exhaled sharply, gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. My mother let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. The judge wasn't finished. He cleared his throat and continued, his voice firm and without sympathy. Furthermore, given the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds that the plaintiffs engaged in defamation against the defendant, resulting in both reputational and non-pecuniary damages. The plaintiffs are hereby ordered to pay the defendant the sum of $50,000 in compensation. I watched as the color drained from my father's face. My mother's quiet sobs turned into full-fledged weeping, her shoulders shaking as she clutched at her purse, like it was the only thing holding her together. And finally the judge said, giving them a hard look, this court issues a permanent injunction prohibiting the plaintiffs from filing any further legal claims against the defendant regarding these matters. This case is closed. A loud bang of the gavel sealed their fate. For the first time since this nightmare had begun all those years ago, I felt something settle deep in my chest. It wasn't just relief, it was finality. My parents had lost, not just the case, but the last shred of power they had ever held over me. As we stood up to leave, my father shot me a look of pure fury, his hands twitching at his sides as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. My mother, still crying, wouldn't even meet my eyes. I didn't say anything to them, there was nothing left to say. As we stepped outside into the crisp air, Sophie reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "You won," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "They can't touch you anymore." I squeezed her hand back, inhaling deeply. She was right for the first time in years. I was finally free. A few months passed, and I barely thought about the trial anymore, though occasionally bits and pieces of news found their way to me. My parents had moved into a small, run-down apartment, after being forced to sell off what little they had left. Lily had left the state entirely, disappearing into another city where no one knew her name or her past. But none of that mattered to me. Their lives were no longer connected to mine. Their choices, their failures, their losses, they belonged to them now, not me. I stood by the window of my home, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the living room. In my arms, my newborn son stirred, his tiny fingers curling against my chest as he let out a quiet sigh in his sleep. I gazed down at him, overwhelmed by the quiet, steady weight of him, the warmth of his small body against mine. "I'll never let you go through what I had to go through," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. A hand rested gently on my shoulder, and I turned slightly to see Tom standing beside me. His expression was softer than usual, his eyes filled with something I had come to recognize as pride. "You're finally free, son," he said simply. I looked at him, at the man who had given me a second chance when I had nothing, at the father I had found in the ashes of my past, and for the first time in my life, I smiled, not out of defiance, not out of relief, but out of something real. Because he was right, I was free. "What do you think? After everything, did my parents deserve what happened to them? Should I have handled it differently, or did they get exactly what they had coming? Let me know your thoughts."